The Island Awakens. The story begins on a cold, windswept island surrounded by endless waves and storms. At first glance, this island seems unimportant, just a cluster of fields, forests, and fishing villages on the edge of Europe. And yet, this forgotten land, Britain, will one day rise from obscurity and bend the world to its will. No one watching then could have imagined it. No one could have believed that this island, small and poor compared to mighty kingdoms like Spain or France, would forge an empire that spanned the globe. But history loves irony, and this island would awaken with fire in its veins. Britain's early years were filled with invasion, war, and survival. From Vikings burning its shores to Norman conquerors ruling with iron fists, the land was shaped by conflict. Each enemy that came to destroy Britain instead left behind something that made it stronger. The English learned resilience from struggle, discipline from hardship, and ambition from being underestimated. The seed of empire was already in the soil, though no one yet could see the harvest to come. In the 15th century, while Spain and Portugal set sail to explore the New World, England remained hesitant, cautious, and fractured by internal wars. To outsiders, the English crown looked weak, its people divided, its resources stretched thin. Few would have gambled on England becoming anything more than a second-rate power. And yet, storms of change were gathering, both on the seas and in the minds of men, that would soon push England into a destiny no one had foreseen. The sea was Britain's curse, and its salvation. Being an island meant constant danger from across the Channel. Armies from France or Spain could attack at any moment. But being an island also meant something else: safety in water, and a chance to build mastery of the waves. Slowly, Englishmen turned their eyes toward the oceans, not just as barriers, but as opportunities. Ships became their weapons. Navigation became their language. The sea was no longer a prison. It was a path to glory. But the rise of Britain did not begin with kings and queens, nor with noble ideals. It began with blood, greed, and steel. English sailors, many of them little better than pirates, ventured out to plunder Spanish galleons, stealing gold torn from the Americas. These men were rogues and outlaws, but they carried the English flag, and with every raid they carved a reputation for daring and ruthlessness. The world was beginning to whisper the name England with both fear and respect. At home, the island itself was transforming. The Protestant Reformation had ripped through England, severing ties with Catholic Rome. This religious break was not just about faith, it was about power. England stood apart, defiant, carving its own identity in opposition to the great Catholic empires of Europe. From this moment, England no longer dreamed of merely surviving. It dreamed of expansion, of proving itself, of claiming a destiny greater than its size suggested. The Elizabethan era became the stage for England's first great performance on the world scene. Under Queen Elizabeth I, explorers like Sir Francis Drake circled the globe, privateers struck fear into Spanish fleets, and colonists planted the first fragile English settlements across the Atlantic. It was dangerous, uncertain, and often disastrous, but it was the beginning of something unstoppable. The island was stirring awake, stretching its limbs across the seas. And yet, England was not invincible. In 1588, the mighty Spanish Armada set sail to crush the island once and for all. The odds were hopeless. Spain's fleet was vast, experienced, and feared. England's navy was small, improvised, and desperate. The world held its breath as storm clouds gathered over the English Channel. If England fell, its dreams of empire would be drowned before they even began. The battle came, fierce and unforgiving. Fire ships lit the night, cannons thundered across the waters, and the fate of England teetered on the edge. And then, a miracle. Storms and English firepower combined to scatter the mighty Armada. Spain's invincible fleet was broken. The island survived, and survival gave birth to confidence. If England could defeat the greatest power on earth, what else might it accomplish? From that day, the English people carried within them a sense of destiny. The sea had tested them, and they had triumphed. The island that was supposed to fall had instead risen. Across Europe, whispers turned to shock. England, the unlikely survivor, had begun its climb to greatness. But survival was only the beginning. Expansion would follow, and with it, riches beyond imagination. Soon, companies of merchants, backed by royal charters, began sending ships to distant lands. The East India Company was born, not as a government plan, but as a business venture, an experiment in profit. No one could know that this company, built for trade, would become the beating heart of an empire. No one could see that private profit would grow into global domination. But history was already in motion. Meanwhile, back home, England was changing in ways no one could ignore. The island's fields, once quiet with farmers, were being transformed by enclosures, new farming methods, and growing cities. London swelled with people, merchants, and ambition. Ideas of progress, invention, and industry began to crackle in the air. The island was not just stirring awake. It was preparing for a transformation unlike anything the world had ever seen. And yet, every transformation brings conflict. England's civil wars tore the nation apart in the 17th century, a reminder that empires are not born without pain. But even in blood and division, the island grew stronger. The monarchy was challenged, Parliament rose, and the people themselves became part of a story greater than kings. England was not just creating an empire abroad. It was forging a new kind of power at home. By the late 1600s, English ships roamed the seas with growing confidence. Colonies in America began to take root, Caribbean islands filled with plantations, and trade flowed back to London. Sugar, tobacco, and slaves became the fuel of empire. It was not glorious. It was brutal. But it was effective. England was beginning to weave its net across the globe. The island's rivals saw what was happening. France, Spain, the Dutch, all watched as England, once weak and divided, grew bold. Wars erupted, battles stretched from Europe to the colonies, and the oceans became battlegrounds. Time and again, England fought for survival, and time and again, it won, inch by bloody inch, until its rivals began to fear its persistence more than its power. The secret to England's rise was not size, but resilience. It was a nation that refused to die, that turned defeat into fuel and survival into victory. Other empires sought glory through sudden conquest. England played the long game, building piece by piece, trading, fighting, and learning. The world began to notice. The island was no longer asleep. It was awake and hungry. And so, as the 18th century dawned, the island that once seemed destined for obscurity stood at the edge of a new world. Its fleets were growing, its colonies spreading, its merchants thriving. The British Empire, though not yet fully formed, was already casting a long shadow. But this was only the beginning. The real storm had not yet come. For in the centuries ahead, Britain would not only rise, it would dominate. It would seize lands across Africa, Asia, and the Americas. It would claim to rule in the name of progress, while hiding chains of slavery and rivers of blood. It would become the empire upon which the sun never set. And yet, just as quickly as it rose, it would fall. And the way it fell, the betrayal, the chaos, the shocking final blow, is a story more gripping than its rise. The island had awakened. The empire had begun. But in the shadows of its victories, enemies were waiting. And in the heart of its triumphs, weaknesses were already forming. The stage was set not just for glory, but for downfall. The question was not if Britain would fall. The question was when. And so, the island's first act ended with sails on the horizon, cannons ready, and ambition burning hotter than ever. But where greed and glory walk hand in hand, danger always follows. In the next chapter, we will step aboard the ships of blood and sea, where Britain's empire will be built not on diplomacy or kindness, but on plunder, piracy, and ruthless hunger. Blood and sea, the ocean, was both battlefield and fortune. For England, still a young power, the sea became the place where destiny would be written. But in these early years, England's rise was not polished, noble, or graceful. It was drenched in blood, sharpened by cutlasses, and stained by smoke from cannon fire. To control the seas, England would first unleash chaos upon them. While Spain carried gold and silver from the New World in mighty fleets, Englishmen watched with hungry eyes. Those ships, heavy with treasure, sailed slowly across the Atlantic, perfect targets for attack. And so, men with daring hearts and ruthless hands took to the sea, armed with speed, trickery, and the blessings of their queen. They called themselves privateers. Their enemies called them pirates. The difference was only in the flag they flew. Sir Francis Drake was the most famous of them all, a man both celebrated and feared. To the English, he was a hero, a knight who circled the globe and struck blows against Spain. To the Spanish, he was El Drac, the dragon, a thief and murderer who brought fire wherever he went. His raids filled England's coffers and humiliated Spain. Each Spanish galleon he captured was not just treasure, it was a message. England was rising. And Drake was not alone. Dozens of English captains, bold and desperate, swarmed the seas. Some sought wealth, others sought revenge. But together, they forged a reputation that England was no longer a passive island, but a predator of the oceans. With each raid, with each cannon fired, England gained confidence. The blood spilled on the waves was the ink with which the empire's first chapter was written. This era of plunder was not only about treasure, it was about survival. England did not yet have the resources or the armies to compete with Spain on land. But at sea, it could strike swiftly and vanish into the horizon. Privateers became the sword of England's ambition, cutting open paths that official armies could not. Where gold and silver flowed, English ships followed like sharks. But piracy carried a cost. Spain, enraged, sought vengeance. The Atlantic roared with battles. English ships were hunted, captured, sunk. Men swung from gallows as warnings. Yet for every loss, more ships appeared, more men willing to risk death for fortune. The ocean became a vast chessboard of blood and fire, and England played the game with ruthless determination. The profits from these ventures poured back into England, fueling growth at home. London stocks buzzed with goods, its markets alive with exotic wares. Spices, sugar, tobacco, luxuries once rare, now flowed in with greater frequency. But the true treasure was not wealth. It was knowledge. New routes, new maps, new possibilities. Every raid expanded England's vision of what it might become. And with this vision came a hunger for more. Piracy had proven that the seas could be England's stage. Now, the question was no longer whether it could harass Spain. The question was whether it could rival Spain. To do that, England needed something greater than pirates. It needed a navy. The seeds of the Royal Navy were planted in this chaos. Ships built not just for trade or plunder, but for war. Men trained not just as sailors, but as warriors of the sea. The idea was simple but revolutionary. If England could master the oceans, no empire could stand against it. The waves would be its shield, and its cannons would be its voice. Yet in those early years, this navy was still fragile, untested, and often outnumbered. Every voyage was a gamble. Storms could destroy a fleet as easily as enemy fire. Disease killed more men than swords. And yet, the English persisted. For every ship lost, 2 more were built. For every defeat, lessons were learned. The empire was being forged in saltwater and smoke. This was also the age of beginnings for England's colonies. Across the Atlantic, fragile outposts like Roanoke and Jamestown struggled to survive. Colonists endured hunger, disease, and war with local tribes. Many failed. Some vanished entirely. But the idea of planting England's flag on foreign soil refused to die. Just as pirates claimed the seas, settlers would claim the land. The connection between plunder and colonization was clear. Privateers paved the way for colonists, securing routes and weakening rivals. Colonists, in turn, created bases from which trade and more raids could be launched. Blood fed the soil. Gold fed the dream. Together, they laid the foundation of empire. The brutality of these years cannot be softened. Men killed for treasure, enslaved others for labor, and fought with a savagery born of desperation. England's rise was not noble. It was ruthless. But ruthlessness was effective. On the waves of the Atlantic, England began to carve its destiny, one bloody raid at a time. Meanwhile, Spain, though still mighty, began to feel the pressure. Its treasure fleets grew heavier, its enemies more daring, its losses more frequent. The empire that once seemed untouchable was being gnawed at, piece by a smaller, hungrier rival. England had found Spain's weakness, and it was exploiting it without mercy. But England was not yet safe. Every victory brought retaliation. Every treasure stolen made Spain more determined to crush the island once and for all. The seas grew more dangerous with each passing year. England was playing a dangerous game, one it could not afford to lose. For if Spain ever landed its full force upon English shores, the island would burn. And so, England's leaders walked a knife's edge, encouraging piracy while fearing the wars it provoked. Queen Elizabeth played a dangerous game of shadows, smiling at Spain in diplomacy while secretly blessing the plunder of her captains. It was deception, risk, and cunning politics, the art of survival dressed as friendship. And through this dance, England bought itself time to grow. This time was crucial, for behind the smoke of cannons and the lure of treasure, something deeper was happening. England was learning to think like an empire. Every raid revealed the scale of the world. Every colony hinted at the possibility of global power. The blood and chaos of these years were not random violence. They were the birth pains of something greater. By the dawn of the 17th century, the shift was undeniable. England was no longer just an island on the edge of Europe. It was a rising force of the seas. Its pirates had become legends. Its colonies were taking root. Its navy was growing stronger. The empire was still fragile, but it was alive, and it was hungry for more. But hunger can be dangerous, for when a nation begins to dream of greatness, it is often blinded to the cost. The oceans had given England power, but they would also demand sacrifice. And soon, the pursuit of empire would draw England into wars greater than it had ever faced. Wars not of survival, but of ambition. The blood-soaked waves had given birth to a navy and a dream. But dreams demand fuel, and England's hunger was insatiable. Ahead lay colonies, trade empires, and a system of exploitation so vast it would reshape the world. In the next chapter, we step into the smoke and iron of the Empire of Smoke, where industry and ambition would transform this pirate kingdom into a global machine of power. Empire of Smoke, the age of plunder, had filled England's coffers, but it was not enough. Raiding ships could bring treasure, but treasure alone could not build a lasting empire. What England needed was something more powerful than gold. And in the 18th century, it found it, not in distant lands, but in the very soil of its island. Coal, iron, smoke. These would become the weapons that transformed a kingdom into the beating heart of the modern world. At first, no one noticed. Coal was dirty, heavy, and unremarkable. Iron was difficult to shape, cumbersome, and ordinary. But as inventors tinkered, as blacksmiths experimented, and as desperate minds sought easier ways to power machines, these humble materials revealed their secrets. Steam roared. Pistons churned. The Industrial Revolution had begun, and Britain was its birthplace. The sight was shocking. Fields once filled with sheep and farmers now sprouted factories and smokestacks. Villages turned into towns, towns into sprawling cities. London swelled with people, while new industrial giants like Manchester and Birmingham rose from nothing, their skies blackened with soot, their streets alive with noise and fire. The island itself was changing into something unrecognizable. This transformation was not gentle. Men, women, and children crowded into factories, laboring long hours in choking air, surrounded by the roar of machines. Accidents were common, wages meager, and lives often short. But behind this suffering, something extraordinary was happening. Britain was building speed, a kind of speed no nation had ever possessed before. While others still relied on muscle and wind, Britain harnessed the power of machines. The steam engine was the crown jewel of this revolution. Trains thundered across the countryside, connecting cities, carrying goods, shrinking distances. Mines plunged deeper into the earth, hauling out coal by the ton. Ships, once dependent on sails, now roared with steam power, able to move even against the wind. The world itself began to feel smaller, and Britain was at its center. Industry fed the empire, and the empire fed industry. Cotton from India and America poured into British mills. Sugar from the Caribbean sweetened British tables. Tea from China became an obsession. Each product tied Britain tighter to distant lands, and each demand drove its factories harder. The empire became a machine, with colonies as its gears and Britain as its engine. But machines alone did not secure empire. Guns did. The Industrial Revolution gave Britain weapons more deadly than any before. Muskets were replaced with rifles. Cannons grew stronger, ships sturdier. Factories could churn out not just cloth, but war. For the first time in history, industrial power meant military power, and Britain held that power in abundance. The Royal Navy, already feared, became unstoppable. Ironclad ships bristling with cannons patrolled the seas, ensuring that British trade flowed freely, while rivals dared not challenge its dominance. To attack British ships was to challenge a war machine backed by factories and steam. Few nations were willing to pay that price. But empire was not built only by weapons. It was built by profit. Banks in London swelled with money. Insurance companies rose to protect the risks of global trade. Stock exchanges boomed as companies sought investors for ventures abroad. Britain was not just conquering land, it was conquering finance. The empire's wealth grew not only in gold and goods, but in paper, contracts, and debts that bound the world to London. And yet, with every new invention, with every new fortune, came new costs. The poor filled slums, living in misery beneath the very wealth their labor created. Disease spread in overcrowded cities. Children grew up without sunlight, their lungs filled with coal dust. Britain was becoming powerful, but at a price paid by its own people. The Empire of Smoke was built not only on colonies abroad, but on the broken bodies of workers at home. Still, ambition overshadowed suffering. The British people began to believe in their destiny, that they were chosen to rule, to expand, to civilize the world. Politicians spoke of empire as a duty, as though conquest were a noble mission. But beneath the speeches, the truth was clear. Empire meant profit, and industry demanded resources. The machine had to be fed, no matter the cost. Railways became the veins of empire, not just at home, but abroad. Across India, tracks were laid to carry goods from the interior to the ports. In Africa, the iron lines spread like claws across the land. Railways promised progress, but they also carried away riches, draining colonies to fuel Britain's hunger. For every track laid, Britain's grip on the world tightened. The Empire of Smoke spread across oceans. British merchants, backed by gunboats, forced open markets that resisted. In China, opium flowed into ports at Britain's demand, even as addiction tore society apart. When China resisted, Britain unleashed the full power of its industrial war machine. The result was humiliation for China and victory for Britain, proof that steam and smoke could bend nations to their knees. And with every victory, Britain's shadow grew longer. Its map stretched wider. Its people celebrated with pride, never imagining that the very machine they worshiped might one day consume them too. For now, the empire seemed unstoppable, its factories churning, its ships ruling, its colonies multiplying. Britain stood at the peak of innovation and ambition. But shadows were already forming. Other nations watched Britain's rise with envy and fear. France, scarred but unbroken, sought revenge. America, once Britain's colony, was growing stronger with each passing year. And in the east, a sleeping giant, India itself, was stirring with discontent, its people weary of being drained by a foreign master. Still, Britain pressed forward. The empire of smoke seemed invincible, its industry unmatched, its navy supreme. The world looked upon the soot-covered island and saw not weakness, but power, a power that reached across oceans, across continents, across lives. And yet, even as smoke darkened the skies, no one could see how quickly that smoke could choke the very empire it built. The irony of empire was this: the stronger Britain grew, the more enemies it created. The more it conquered, the more it provoked. Every colony was both a jewel and a wound, glittering with wealth, but bleeding resentment. The empire of smoke was mighty, but it was also fragile, balanced on the backs of workers, soldiers, and subjects who might one day refuse to carry it. Still, for the moment, Britain celebrated. Factories roared, ships launched, colonies expanded. The machine was alive, unstoppable, and hungry. The empire was no longer just a dream of adventurers or pirates. It was a living force, pulsing with steam, smoke, and ambition. And its hunger would soon carry it into the heart of Asia, Africa, and beyond. But hunger never ends. It only grows. And in its hunger, Britain would make choices that would define not just its rise, but its downfall. For in India, the jewel of its empire, Britain would find both its greatest wealth and its greatest rebellion. And the story of India would shake the empire to its core. The empire of smoke had been built, towering and mighty. But now, we step into its brightest jewel and darkest wound. India, the jewel in the crown. A land where Britain's ambition would shine at its height, and where the seeds of rebellion would be planted, waiting to explode. India, the jewel. When the British spoke of their empire, one phrase returned again and again: the jewel in the crown. That jewel was India. Vast, ancient, and rich beyond imagination. India dazzled Britain with its spices, its silk, its jewels, and its endless millions of people. To control India was to hold a treasure chest that could fund an empire. But to rule, it was to awaken a storm. Britain's grip on India began not with armies, but with merchants. The East India Company, at first just a trading venture, slowly grew claws. Its agents bought influence, its soldiers guarded profits, and its money bought loyalty from local rulers. One by one, kingdoms fell under its shadow. What began as trade became domination. India was not conquered in a day. It was swallowed piece by piece. The company's power soon rivaled that of nations. It commanded its own private armies, numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Its generals waged wars. Its governors ruled provinces. Its factories turned Indian cotton into British wealth. At its height, the East India Company was not just a business, It was an empire within the empire, richer than kings and more ruthless than armies. But its rule was built on exploitation. Indian farmers grew indigo and cotton for export while famine swept through their villages. Taxes drained the land. Traditional industries collapsed under the flood of cheap British goods. The company grew fat on profit, but the people it ruled starved. The jewel glittered in Britain's crown, but it was stained with suffering. And yet, Britain also brought change. Railways cut across India, telegraphs linked cities, and English schools taught a new generation of Indians Western ideas of law, science, and even liberty. To some, these were signs of progress. To others, they were chains, tools to control, not to uplift. For every mile of railway, there was a deeper debt. For every school, there was a silenced voice. The tension grew with each passing decade. Indian soldiers, called sepoys, filled the company's ranks, fighting its wars and defending its rule. They were loyal, disciplined, and essential. But they were also watching, waiting, aware that their loyalty was being tested to the breaking point. They were the empire's sword, but they could also become its dagger. The breaking point came in 1857. It began with whispers, rumors that the cartridges given to sepoys were greased with pig and cow fat, an insult to both Muslim and Hindu faiths. Outrage spread like fire. What began as refusal to bite a cartridge became open rebellion. Sepoys rose against their officers, towns erupted in violence, and suddenly the company's empire trembled. The Sepoy Rebellion, or First War of Independence, as many in India call it, shook Britain to its core. Mutiny spread across northern India. Soldiers turned their guns on their masters, and civilians joined in. British families were slaughtered, forts burned, and for a moment, it seemed the jewel might shatter. Panic spread through London. The empire's greatest prize was slipping away. Britain responded with fury. Reinforcements poured in. Villages were burned in retaliation, rebels executed without mercy, and the land was drowned in blood. For a year, the struggle raged, brutal and unforgiving. In the end, Britain crushed the rebellion. But the cost was heavy, not just in lives, but in illusions. The dream of peaceful, willing subjects had been shattered forever. In the rebellion's aftermath, the East India Company's rule ended. The British Crown took direct control, declaring India part of the empire itself. Queen Victoria became Empress of India, and the jewel was polished brighter than ever. Palaces gleamed, ceremonies dazzled, and British officials paraded their power. But beneath the glitter, cracks spread wider. For the British, India was a symbol of pride. Its railways, its law courts, its British-built cities like Calcutta and Bombay were displayed as proof of civilization. But for Indians, these were also symbols of control. Every train carried resources out, not wealth in. Every courthouse handed down laws that favored the rulers, not the ruled. The jewel shone, but it belonged to someone else. And with every year, resentment deepened. Educated Indians, taught in English schools, began to question why the values of liberty and justice were preached but not practiced. If Britain claimed to bring progress, why did it deny Indians a voice? If it preached equality, why were Indians treated as subjects, not citizens? The contradictions grew sharper with every passing decade. Still, the British believed they were invincible. Their armies were vast, their technology unmatched, their grip secure. India, they thought, would remain theirs forever. After all, how could millions resist the might of the empire? But history has a way of humbling the proud, and already the seeds of rebellion were buried deep, waiting for the right moment to rise again. The jewel glittered brightest during the reign of Queen Victoria. Great exhibitions in London displayed Indian treasures to admiring crowds. The empire seemed endless, eternal, unbreakable. British citizens took pride in saying that the sun never set on their empire, for wherever the sun shone, the Union Jack flew. And yet, this arrogance blinded them to the storm brewing beneath the surface. India's millions watched, learned, and remembered. They saw how Britain profited from their labor, how their wealth flowed outward while their people struggled. They saw how Britain's glory was built on their backs. And though they were patient, their patience had limits. The jewel in the crown was not dead. It was waiting to cut. The irony was cruel. The very education Britain brought to India would become the weapon against it. A generation of Indian lawyers, writers, and thinkers began to speak of nationalism, of freedom, of self-rule. They formed groups, whispered ideas, and slowly, a new vision took shape, not of India serving Britain, but of India standing alone. For Britain, the empire had reached dazzling heights. India's riches seemed endless, its people manageable, its lands secure. But this was an illusion. The cracks in the jewel were spreading, hairline fractures that one day would break it apart. The rebellion of 1857 had been crushed, but it was only the first tremor. Greater quakes were coming. And so, Britain basked in its triumph, blind to the danger. Parades marched, flags flew, and speeches echoed of destiny and power. The empire was celebrated as eternal. But eternity is a lie. Every empire falls. The only question is how and when. For now, India gleamed in Britain's crown, the greatest prize of all. But hidden beneath the glitter, the fire of resistance smoldered. And once lit, it would burn hotter than Britain could ever imagine. The jewel would one day turn against the hand that wore it. The jewel was secure for the moment. But in the West, across the Atlantic, another story had already begun. Britain's first great colony, America, had slipped away, teaching the empire lessons it would never forget. In the next chapter, we turn to War and Tea, the rebellion that shook Britain, and the colony that dared to break free. War and Tea, the British Empire stood tall in the 18th century, confident in its growing power. Its merchants thrived, its navy ruled the seas, and its colonies stretched across the globe. But across the Atlantic, in 13 colonies along the American coast, cracks were forming. What Britain saw as loyal settlements were beginning to stir with discontent, and soon that discontent would explode into revolution. At first, the colonies seemed like Britain's dream fulfilled. They provided timber, tobacco, furs, and crops, feeding Britain's markets and factories. Their ports bustled with ships bearing the Union Jack. Their settlers spoke English, lived under English law, and considered themselves subjects of the crown. To Britain, America was not a threat. It was an asset, a jewel of a different kind. But colonies are not meant to stay silent forever. The distance across the ocean bred independence. Colonists grew used to making their own decisions, running their own assemblies, and managing their own affairs. They were British, yes, but they were also something new. A people born in America, shaped by its vast lands and freedoms, began to see themselves as different from those across the sea. The trouble began with money. Britain had fought costly wars in Europe, including the 7 Years' War, which secured much of North America from France. Victory was sweet, but the bill was enormous. And so, Britain looked to its colonies to pay their share. Taxes were levied on paper, on stamps, on tea. To Britain, it was fair. To the colonists, it was tyranny. The slogan was born: no taxation without representation. Colonists did not object to taxes themselves, but to the idea that they were imposed without their consent. They had no representatives in the British Parliament. They had no voice in the decisions that governed their lives. To them, it was a betrayal, the Crown treating them not as partners, but as subjects to be milked for gold. Tension grew, each tax a spark in dry grass. Protests erupted, pamphlets spread, and secret groups formed. Britain responded with troops, determined to keep its colonies in line. But soldiers in the streets only deepened resentment. To the colonists, redcoats were not protectors, they were occupiers. Each passing year brought the two sides closer to confrontation. The breaking point came with tea. In 1773, Britain granted the East India Company the right to sell its tea directly to the colonies, undercutting local merchants. To Britain, it was a clever solution to a financial problem. To the colonists, it was proof that Britain cared nothing for them. In Boston, anger boiled over. One night, disguised men boarded ships and hurled chests of tea into the harbor. The Boston Tea Party had begun. The message was clear. The colonies would not submit quietly. But Britain, proud and stubborn, answered with the intolerable acts, laws designed to punish and control. Ports were closed, assemblies dissolved, and British authority tightened. Instead of obedience, Britain's iron hand brought defiance. The colonies, once fractured, began to unite against a common enemy. When the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord in 1775, the world changed forever. Farmers, blacksmiths, and ordinary men stood against trained British soldiers. Muskets cracked, smoke filled the fields, and the impossible seemed to happen. Colonists resisted. The American Revolution had begun, and the empire trembled at the thought of losing its prize. At first, Britain was confident. Its armies were professional, its navy unmatched, its wealth vast. The rebels were poorly armed, poorly trained, and divided. How could they possibly stand against the might of the empire? But wars are not won by power alone. They are won by determination, and the Americans had it in abundance. The colonists fought with passion, using guerrilla tactics, striking quickly and fading into the forests. They knew the land the British did not. They fought not for empire, but for survival, for freedom, for an identity of their own. Each battle, win or lose, strengthened their resolve. Britain won victories, but never peace. The rebellion refused to die. The war escalated when France, Britain's old rival, joined the American side. French ships, soldiers, and gold turned the tide. What began as a rebellion became a global war. Spain too joined against Britain, eager for revenge. Suddenly, Britain was fighting not just colonies, but the combined might of Europe. The empire that thought itself invincible was being tested like never before. In 1781, the decisive blow fell at Yorktown. Surrounded by American and French forces, the British army surrendered. Cannons fell silent, flags lowered, and Britain's pride lay in ruins. The unthinkable had happened. 13 colonies had broken free. Across the world, empires gasped. If Britain could lose America, what else could it lose? In London, shock and despair filled the air. The empire that had seemed unstoppable was humbled. Politicians argued, generals were blamed, and the public mourned the loss of an empire across the sea. For Britain, America was more than a colony, it was a symbol. And now that symbol was gone. But defeat brings lessons. Britain realized that its empire could not survive by force alone. It needed cunning, flexibility, and above all, the power of the seas. The loss of America was a wound, but also a teacher. If Britain wished to remain an empire, it would need to adapt, and it would. For the Americans, victory was liberation. For the British, defeat was humiliation. But history has a cruel sense of irony. In losing America, Britain turned its gaze elsewhere, to India, to Africa, to the Pacific. The empire would not shrink. It would expand further, faster, and more ruthlessly than before. Yet, the memory of America haunted Britain. The image of colonists defying the crown burned deep. Every colony that followed would be measured against that loss. Every rebellion would carry the ghost of Boston and Yorktown. The jewel had slipped away, and Britain swore never to lose another so easily. Still, the empire survived. Its navy grew, its merchants thrived, its industry boomed. America was gone, but the rest of the world lay open. And Britain, wounded but unbroken, intended to take it all. The loss of America was not the end of the empire. It was the spark that lit its second, even greater age. But the question lingered, had Britain truly learned the lesson of America? Or would pride, greed, and arrogance lead it down the same path again? The answer would come not in the colonies it lost, but in the vast new lands it was about to seize. Lands that would test its strength, its morality, and its very soul. The tea had spilled, the colonies gone, but Britain's hunger was undimmed. Ahead lay Africa, where the empire would carve borders with blood and steel. In the next chapter, we descend into Africa carved, the scramble that would bring Britain glory, riches, and a legacy of scars that remain to this day. Africa carved the 19th century brought with it a hunger unlike anything the world had seen before. Britain had lost America, but gained India. Its industries roared with steam, its factories demanded raw materials, and its merchants demanded markets. And so, the empire's gaze turned south to a continent rich in resources, vast in land, and divided by kingdoms and tribes. Africa. To Britain, it was not a land of nations, but a treasure chest waiting to be opened. At first, Britain's presence in Africa was limited to the coasts, forts for trade, ports for ships, outposts for merchants. But with industry surging at home, with steamships and railways shrinking distance, the temptation of Africa's interior grew irresistible. Gold, diamonds, ivory, rubber, the riches of Africa called to Britain's empire like sirens. And Britain, already powerful, could not resist. But Britain was not alone. France, Belgium, Germany, and other powers eyed the same lands with the same greed. The scramble for Africa had begun, a mad race where European powers carved up a continent as if it were a feast. At the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 85, men who had never set foot in Africa drew lines on maps, slicing rivers, splitting tribes, and creating borders that still scar the land today. For Britain, the prize was clear: control from the north to the south, a chain of colonies that would stretch like a backbone through Africa. Cairo to Cape Town, a dream of red lines across the map. It was an ambition, both grand and ruthless. And to achieve it, Britain would use every weapon at its disposal: diplomacy, trade, and war. Diamonds glittered in South Africa, discovered in the 1860s. Then came gold, vast deposits that promised unimaginable wealth. Suddenly, Africa was not just a distant land. It was the heart of empire's hunger. Men like Cecil Rhodes dreamed of conquest and profit. Companies backed by the crown pushed deeper inland, and the native peoples of Africa found themselves standing against a tide that would not stop. The Zulu, fierce and proud, resisted British expansion in southern Africa. Their warriors fought with courage against rifles and cannons, their spears clashing against steel. In 1879, at the Battle of Isandlwana, the Zulu inflicted one of Britain's most shocking defeats, annihilating a regiment in a storm of spears and fury. For a moment, the empire trembled, but Britain's retribution was swift. With more troops, more guns, and relentless determination, the Zulu were crushed. In the north, the story was no different. Egypt, with its vital Suez Canal, the lifeline of empire, the shortcut to India, fell under British control. Officially, it was protection. In truth, it was domination. Whoever controlled the Suez controlled the empire's heart, and Britain would never let it go. But perhaps the most brutal struggle came in Sudan. There, a religious leader, the Mahdi, rose against foreign rule, rallying thousands of fighters. In 1885, his forces captured Khartoum, and General Garden, Britain's man in the city, was killed. The news shocked London. Once again, the empire's pride was wounded. Years later, Britain returned with overwhelming force, machine guns tearing through waves of Sudanese warriors. The land was conquered, but the blood spilled left a stain that could never be erased. This was Britain's way in Africa: overwhelm, dominate, exploit. Railways were laid not to connect African peoples, but to carry out minerals and crops. Plantations spread not for African prosperity, but for European profit. Schools and missions promised education, but they also stripped away culture and identity. Britain claimed it was bringing civilization. In truth, it was extracting wealth. And with wealth came suffering. African farmers were forced to grow cash crops instead of food, leading to famine. Taxes were imposed on people who had never known such systems. Lands were seized, traditions broken, families torn apart. Entire generations were reshaped to serve the empire's hunger. The scars ran deep, and they remain to this day. Resistance never stopped. From the Ashanti in West Africa to the Ndebele in the south, Africans fought back with courage, but rifles and Maxim machine guns mowed them down. The battles were never fair. For every victory like Isandlwana, there were massacres where entire villages were destroyed. The empire marched forward, and Africa bled. Cecil Rhodes embodied the empire's arrogance. He dreamed of British rule from Cape to Cairo, a world dominated by Anglo-Saxon power. His companies seized land, his policies exploited people, and his name was stamped across territories, Rhodesia, a land named not for its people, but for its conqueror. To him, empire was destiny. To Africans, it was disaster. Yet even as Britain expanded, rivals loomed. The French pushed from the west, Germany from the east, Belgium from the Congo. Africa became a chessboard of empire, where European powers clashed not over African voices, but over their own ambitions. The people of Africa were treated not as nations, but as obstacles to be moved, silenced, or erased. By the turn of the 20th century, Britain had achieved much of its dream. From Egypt in the north to South Africa in the south, red lines stretched across the map. The Union Jack flew over lands vast and varied. Britain claimed victory, but the cost was staggering. Entire cultures were crushed, lives lost, and Africa's future rewritten by foreign hands. And yet, for all its power, Britain could not kill the spirit of resistance. Across Africa, whispers of independence began to stir. Leaders rose, traditions endured, and the memory of conquest was never forgotten. The empire might rule with guns and laws, but it could never own the hearts of its subjects. Still, in London, Africa was hailed as triumph. Diamonds sparkled in markets, gold-fueled banks, and rubber-fed factories. Politicians boasted of empire, of civilization, of progress. Few spoke of the massacres, the famines, the chains. To the British public, Africa was proof of greatness. To Africans, it was proof of cruelty. The scramble for Africa was not a story of glory. It was a story of greed. And though Britain gained much, it also planted seeds of resentment that would one day grow into revolutions. Every border drawn at the Berlin Conference was a future wound. Every village burned was a memory that would not die. For now, Britain stood tall, its empire richer, larger, stronger. The map of the world blazed red. But arrogance breeds blindness. Britain believed it had secured Africa forever. In truth, it had only borrowed time. The people it crushed would one day rise. The empire's victories were written in smoke. Its defeats were waiting. And so, Britain left Africa carved, broken, and bleeding. Its empire glittered with wealth stolen from the continent, but beneath the glitter lay a foundation of bones. The empire believed itself eternal. But history was watching, and history does not forget. Africa carved, India chained, America lost. Britain's empire grew vast, but fragile. And now, as the 20th century dawned, a storm greater than any before was coming. The Great War would shake the empire to its core. In the next chapter, we enter the Great War, where Britain's pride would be tested in trenches of mud, blood, and fire. The Great War, the year was 1914. Europe stood on the edge of fire. Old alliances, old rivalries, and the sparks of nationalism created a tinderbox waiting to explode. When the first gunshot rang out in Sarajevo, it seemed like just another conflict in the Balkans. But within weeks, the world was at war. A war unlike anything humanity had ever seen. And for Britain, the empire's fate would be forever changed in the mud of the trenches. When Britain declared war on Germany, its empire answered the call. Soldiers from India, Africa, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand marched under the Union Jack. Millions of men, speaking different languages, practicing different faiths, were drawn into Europe's war. For Britain, this was proof of empire's strength. For the colonies, it was a grim reminder. They were bound to fight a war that was not their own. The trenches of the Western Front were hell on earth. Endless mud, barbed wire, machine guns that cut down men in seconds. Battles dragged on for months for inches of land. Names like the Somme and Passchendaele became synonyms for slaughter. Britain's young men, the pride of its future, were fed into a machine that chewed them up and spat out bodies. And yet, Britain endured. Factories at home worked day and night, producing guns, shells, and uniforms. Women stepped into roles they had never held before, keeping the war machine alive. The empire's colonies sent food, soldiers, and supplies. India alone provided over 1 million troops. The war was not just Britain's fight. It was the empire's burden. But burden has a cost. In India, resentment grew. Promises of reform and freedom were made to gain support, promises that would later be broken. In Africa, forced labor and recruitment sparked anger. In Ireland, rebellion brewed. The Great War was supposed to unite the empire. Instead, it began to expose the cracks. On the seas, Britain's navy still ruled. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sinking ships, but Britain's blockade strangled Germany's supplies. The old truth held. Britain's power was the ocean. But even this came at a price. Merchant ships were sunk, civilians drowned, and the empire's lifelines were threatened as never before. In 1916, the Battle of the Somme became a symbol of both courage and futility. On the first day alone, nearly 60,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded. Entire battalions of young men vanished in hours. Families across Britain received telegrams of death. The empire bled, and the question whispered in the dark was it worth it? The war dragged on, year after year. The scale of destruction was unimaginable. Entire villages in France and Belgium disappeared. Cities across Europe were scarred. Millions of lives ended, millions more broken. For Britain, victory seemed distant, but surrender was unthinkable. The empire's pride demanded endurance, no matter the cost. Then, in 1917, a shift. The United States entered the war, bringing fresh troops and resources. Germany, exhausted, pushed one last desperate offensive. The British and their allies held the line. Slowly, the tide turned. By 1918, the German army collapsed. The war was over. Britain had won, or so it seemed. Victory came with parades, flags, and celebrations. Britain stood among the victors, its empire larger than ever, having seized German colonies in Africa and the Middle East. Politicians declared that Britain had proven its strength. But behind the speeches, a darker truth lingered. The empire was not stronger. It was bleeding inside. The cost of the Great War was staggering. Nearly 1 million British soldiers dead. Millions more wounded. Entire towns had lost their young men. The empire was stretched thin, its treasury drained, its people weary. Victory had come at a price so high it felt almost like defeat. And worse, the colonies had changed. Indian soldiers who had fought in Europe returned home with new questions. Why should they fight and die for Britain while living under its rule? Promises of greater self-government had been dangled before them, but after the war, Britain hesitated. Disappointment turned to anger. Seeds of rebellion were watered with blood. In the Middle East, Britain's victory planted new troubles. Promises made to Arabs during the war were broken. Borders drawn in London and Paris with little regard for the people who lived there. Mandates and protectorates replaced freedom. Britain gained land, but it also gained enemies who would never forget betrayal. At home, the empire's glow dimmed. The war had shattered illusions of glory. The image of neat battles and swift victories was gone. Now, people saw empire for what it demanded: sacrifice without end. The question began to echo louder. Was the empire worth the blood spilled in foreign fields? The war also brought change within Britain itself. Women who had worked in factories, on farms, and in offices now demanded rights. The social order trembled. Old aristocratic power weakened. The world after 1918 was not the same as before. And Britain, though it claimed victory, was weakened, shaken, uncertain. The Great War was meant to be the war to end all wars. But even as peace was signed, unrest spread. Ireland erupted in rebellion, demanding independence. India's protests grew louder. In Africa, resentment simmered. The empire had survived the fire, but the fire had left cracks that could not be hidden. The illusion of invincibility was gone. Britain could no longer pretend that its empire was unshakable. The war had shown that even the strongest could bleed, that even the proudest could stumble. The empire still stood, but its foundation was weakened, and the world was watching. For now, Britain told itself that it was stronger, larger, victorious. But in truth, the war had changed everything. The people who had fought for Britain now dreamed of freedom. The rivals who had fallen would rise again. And the empire itself was weary, its pride wounded, its resources strained. The Great War ended, but its shadow stretched into the future. It was not the final blow to Britain's empire. It was the beginning of the end, the first great crack in a structure that had seemed eternal. And though Britain could not see it yet, the next war would be even worse. And this time, survival itself would be at stake. The Great War had scarred the empire, but Britain staggered onward. Yet peace was an illusion. The years between the wars would bring unrest, rebellion, and new challenges. In the next chapter, we enter between wars, where the empire tried to hold its grip while the world slipped through its fingers. Between wars, the guns of the Great War had fallen silent, but the echoes still haunted the empire. Britain had won, but victory felt hollow. Cemeteries stretched across France, filled with young men who would never return. At home, families carried grief like chains. The empire was larger than ever, but its spirit was weary. Britain called it peace, but it was really only an intermission before the next storm. In London, leaders tried to present an image of strength. The Union Jack flew proudly over new colonies in Africa and the Middle East. Maps in schools still blazed with red, showing children that their nation ruled the world. But behind the red paint was a truth politicians tried to hide. The empire was bleeding money, staggering under debt, and struggling to control the restless millions it governed. The war had promised change, but the empire delivered little. In India, soldiers who had fought in Europe returned with medals on their chests and questions in their minds. They had died for Britain, but still lived under its rule. The promises of self-government, made in whispers during the war, dissolved into silence. Frustration boiled over. Protests filled the streets. A new leader rose, Mohandas K. Gandhi, preaching resistance not with weapons, but with nonviolence. Gandhi's movement shook the empire in ways bullets never had. Mass marches, boycotts, and civil disobedience turned ordinary Indians into warriors of principle. The British responded with arrests, beatings, and sometimes massacres, like the horror at Amritsar in 1919, where soldiers fired into a peaceful crowd, killing hundreds. The empire's mask of justice cracked, revealing the iron fist beneath. Ireland too seethed with rebellion. During the war, nationalists had risen in the Easter Rising of 1916, and though crushed, their cause lived on. After years of guerrilla warfare and bloodshed, Ireland finally broke free in 1922. It was a humiliation for Britain, a reminder that even lands close to home could not be held forever. The empire had lost not just a colony, but a piece of its heart. In Africa, resentment smoldered. Colonies that had sent men to fight in Europe saw no reward, only deeper exploitation. Taxes, forced labor, and the constant stripping of resources fed anger. Resistance grew quietly, in whispers and in movements, but it was there, waiting. The empire looked solid, but its foundations were cracking. The 1920s promised stability, but stability was an illusion. Britain faced economic strain, strikes, and political unrest at home. Factories slowed, unemployment rose, and the glitter of empire felt dim against the gray reality of daily life. The cost of global power was beginning to weigh heavily on the island that claimed to rule the seas. And then came the Great Depression. In 1929, the world's economy collapsed. Markets crashed, trade shriveled, and millions faced poverty. For Britain, whose empire relied on global commerce, it was a devastating blow. Colonies struggled, exports fell, and resentment grew sharper. The empire that had once seemed like a source of endless wealth now looked like a chain dragging Britain down. Meanwhile, new powers rose. In America, industry surged back to life, promising a rival to Britain's global influence. In Asia, Japan grew bold, flexing its military power and eyeing territories. And in Europe, Germany, humiliated by defeat, simmered with anger and plotted revenge. Britain still claimed supremacy, but the world was shifting beneath its feet. At home, the empire's image remained polished. Royal ceremonies dazzled crowds. Exhibitions displayed treasures from across the globe, and films and books painted the empire as noble and eternal. But for those who looked closer, the truth was undeniable. The empire was straining, its people restless, its rivals sharpening their swords. In Palestine, Britain's promises to both Jews and Arabs during the Great War turned into chaos. Conflict exploded, with riots and violence erupting. Britain found itself trapped in a conflict it could not resolve, its reputation damaged further. Each promise broken was another crack in the empire's armor. Egypt too demanded independence. In 1922, Britain granted it, but only partially, keeping control of the Suez Canal, the empire's most vital artery. Britain had learned from Ireland that brute force could not always hold nations, but it was unwilling to let go entirely. The illusion of independence hid the reality of continued control. For the colonies, the interwar years were a time of awakening. Newspapers spread ideas. Schools produced new leaders. Political movements grew bolder. Across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, a new question began to take root. If America could break free, if Ireland could break free, why not us? The empire was vast, but it was also fragile. Holding it together required constant pressure, soldiers, administrators, money. Each new rebellion stretched resources thinner. Each protest chipped away at authority. The empire was like a giant balancing on shaky legs, pretending to dance while fighting to remain upright. Britain's leaders clung to pride. They told themselves that the empire was still strong, still eternal. They pointed to the red on the map, the navy on the seas, the trade in the markets. But pride is a dangerous illusion. Beneath the surface, the empire was tired, and the world was preparing to test it again. For in Germany, a new leader had risen. His name was Adolf Hitler. His promises of revenge, power, and expansion began to ignite Europe once more. In Italy, Mussolini dreamed of empire reborn. In Japan, generals plotted conquest. The stage was being set for a conflict even greater than the last. Britain, still staggering from the First War, would soon be thrown into another, one that would push the empire to its breaking point. But in the 1930s, Britain could not yet see the full storm. It clung to appeasement, hoping to avoid another war, even as enemies grew bold. At home, people remembered the slaughter of the trenches and prayed never to see it again. The empire looked outward with caution, but the storm clouds only grew darker. And yet, in the colonies, hope grew. Nationalists saw Europe's weakness, its fear, its divisions. They whispered that Britain was not invincible. They prepared quietly, waiting for the moment when the empire would be too distracted to hold them down. The interwar years were not peace. They were preparation. The empire still stood, red and vast, but the mask of invincibility had slipped. Britain was a lion, scarred and limping, trying to roar as loudly as before. Its pride remained, but its strength was waning. The question was no longer if the empire would be tested again. The question was when. The answer came in 1939, with the thunder of tanks and the scream of bombers. The Second World War had begun, and Britain's empire would face its greatest trial. In the next chapter, we plunge into World War II, where Britain would fight not just for its empire, but for survival itself. World War II, the year was 1939. Once again, Europe was on fire. German tanks rolled across Poland, and Britain, bound by honor and fear, declared war. The world that had barely recovered from the last great conflict was plunged into another, one even more brutal, more total, more destructive. For Britain, this was not just a war for empire. This was a war for survival. At first, there was silence. Months passed with little fighting, a phony war of waiting and watching. But in 1940, the storm broke. Germany's blitzkrieg, lightning war, swept through France in weeks. The armies of Europe crumbled before Hitler's advance. Britain's allies fell, leaving the island alone, staring across the channel at a Nazi war machine preparing to invade. The world held its breath. Britain, the mighty empire, was cornered. Its armies had fled at Dunkirk, rescued only by a desperate evacuation of ships, fishing boats, and anything that could float. France had fallen. Europe belonged to Hitler. Only Britain remained defiant, standing on its island like a fortress of smoke and steel. Then came the Blitz. German bombers darkened the skies over London, Coventry, Liverpool. Night after night, sirens wailed, fires blazed, and families huddled in shelters as bombs rained down. Thousands died, cities burned, but Britain refused to break. Winston Churchill's voice echoed across the airwaves. "We shall never surrender." The empire's heart beat stubbornly on, defiance stronger than fear. But Britain was not truly alone. Across its empire, colonies once again sent soldiers, supplies, and sacrifice. Indian troops fought in North Africa. African regiments marched in Europe. Australian and New Zealand forces battled in the Pacific. Canada's men crossed the Atlantic to join the fight. The empire's people, bound by obligation and loyalty, became Britain's shield. Without them, the island would have fallen. Yet the war revealed the empire's fragility. Soldiers from India and Africa saw the hypocrisy of fighting for freedom while living under British rule. Promises of independence whispered during the war would later be broken. For many, the war was not just against fascism, it was a chance to demand dignity, to plant the seeds of rebellion that would bloom after victory. The war stretched across the globe. In North Africa, British forces clashed with Rommel's Afrika Korps in the desert sands. Battles raged over oil, supply lines, and empire's survival. In Asia, Japan struck like lightning, seizing British colonies with shocking speed. Singapore, once called the Gibraltar of the East, fell in 1942. Tens of thousands of British soldiers marched into captivity. The myth of empire's invincibility shattered overnight. India, the jewel of the crown, became both lifeline and liability. Millions of Indian troops fought bravely under the Union Jack, but at home, famine and political unrest tore the land apart. In 1942, Gandhi launched the Quit India movement, demanding Britain leave. British prisons filled with protesters, but the message was clear. The empire's strongest jewel was beginning to slip from its grasp. At sea, Britain's navy fought a desperate war to keep lifelines open. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sinking merchant ships by the hundreds. Britain starved for food and fuel. Convoys, guarded by destroyers, became lifelines. Without them, the island would collapse. The empire had once ruled the seas. Now it clung to survival against the wolf packs of the deep. The turning point came slowly. In 1941, Hitler made a fatal mistake. He invaded the Soviet Union. Then, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, bringing the United States into the war. Suddenly, Britain was no longer alone. The tide shifted. American industry, Soviet armies, and Britain's stubborn defiance combined into a force even the Axis could not withstand. From El Alamein to D-Day, Britain and its allies clawed back victory. The deserts of North Africa were reclaimed. The skies over Europe belonged once again to Allied bombers. And on June 6, 1944, British, American, and Canadian troops stormed the beaches of Normandy. The liberation of Europe had begun, and the end of Hitler's empire was in sight. But victory came at a cost. Britain was exhausted, its cities scarred, its people weary. The empire had survived, but it was no longer the master of the world. America's wealth and the Soviet Union's power overshadowed Britain. The sun had not yet set on the empire, but it was dimming fast. The war ended in 1945 with both triumph and tragedy. Hitler was dead, Germany defeated, Japan crushed after the horror of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Britain stood among the victors once more. But victory tasted different this time. The empire was alive, but only barely. Its strength was hollow, its debts immense, its people weary of endless sacrifice. And across the empire, change was unstoppable. In India, independence was no longer a dream, it was a demand. In Africa, whispers of freedom grew louder. In the Middle East, Britain's broken promises ignited unrest. The war had been fought in the name of liberty, but liberty was the very thing Britain denied its subjects. The contradiction was unbearable. For Britain itself, the post-war years were bleak. Bombed-out cities, rationing, and economic collapse replaced the pride of victory. The empire had fought to save itself, and in doing so, had spent everything it had. The torch of global power passed quietly across the Atlantic into American hands. And yet, in Britain's darkest hour, its people clung to pride. Churchill's words, the courage of the Blitz, the survival against impossible odds, these became legend. The empire might have been weakened, but its spirit of defiance remained, a story Britain would tell itself for generations. The question was no longer whether the empire would endure, but how long it could pretend to. The war also exposed the empire's truth to the world. Britain claimed to fight for freedom, but millions saw the hypocrisy. Why should Africans, Indians, and Asians die for a freedom they did not share? The war was the empire's greatest test, and though it survived, it emerged wounded, exposed, and vulnerable. The colonies, once obedient, had seen Britain stumble. They had seen it beg for help, seen its great strongholds fall, seen its weakness revealed. The myth was gone. The empire might still rule, but the fear that once held nations in place had vanished. Now, the will to resist was rising. World War II was not the end of the British Empire, but it was the beginning of the end. The victories won in Europe and Asia could not hide the truth. Britain was no longer the world's master. Its empire was too vast to hold, its people too restless, its rivals too strong. The sun was setting, even if Britain refused to see it. The empire had survived Hitler, but it would not survive its own colonies. Ahead lay India's independence, the unraveling of Africa, and the collapse of control across the globe. In the next chapter, we watch the sun set as the jewel of India slips away and the British Empire begins its final fall. The sun sets the war had ended, but the peace was an illusion. Britain stood battered, its cities scarred, its treasury drained. The empire it had fought to save was now slipping beyond its control. And at the heart of it all was India, the jewel in the crown, the land Britain thought it could never lose. But in 1947, the impossible happened. The jewel broke free. For years, India had waited, watching Britain fight its wars, watching its promises falter. Soldiers had died in Europe, Africa, and Asia for Britain's survival. Millions had starved in Bengal during the famine of 1943, while food was exported for the empire's war effort. The contradiction was unbearable. Britain spoke of freedom while denying it to the very people who kept it alive. The Quit India movement of 1942 had shaken the empire. Gandhi's voice, calm yet relentless, called for Britain to leave. Millions marched, protested, and filled the prisons. Though suppressed, the movement had planted a truth that could not be ignored. India would not remain a colony forever. Britain's grip was loosening. By 1945, Britain was exhausted. Its army was strong, but its economy was broken. America and the Soviet Union now dominated the world stage. The empire was too vast to manage, too expensive to maintain. The sun, once thought eternal on the Union Jack, was sinking. And India, vast and restless, was the first to demand the twilight. Talks of independence grew louder. British leaders realized that holding India by force would mean endless war, and Britain no longer had the strength. For centuries, Britain had ruled through authority and fear. But fear had vanished. The Indian people no longer saw Britain as invincible. The age of obedience was over. Yet independence came not as a gentle transition, but as a storm. Religious tensions between Hindus and Muslims, inflamed over decades of colonial rule, exploded as the British prepared to withdraw. The subcontinent was torn apart, split into India and Pakistan. The partition unleashed rivers of blood. Millions fled across new borders, families torn apart, trains arriving full of corpses. It was independence, but at a terrible price. For Britain, the departure was both shame and relief. The jewel was gone, but so too was the burden. London's politicians spun it as success, proof that Britain could grant freedom gracefully. But behind closed doors, the truth was clear. The empire had lost its crown, and with it, the illusion of eternity. The loss of India sent shockwaves across the world. If the jewel could fall, what of the rest? Across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, whispers grew louder. Nationalists looked to India and said, "If they can, so can we." Britain's empire had survived the cannons of war, but it could not withstand a cry for freedom. Palestine erupted in conflict, caught between Jewish and Arab claims. Britain, weary and unable to solve the crisis, withdrew in 1948, leaving chaos in its wake. The new state of Israel was born amid war, and another piece of Britain's empire slipped away. The empire was unraveling, thread by thread. In Africa, movements stirred. The Gold Coast, Kenya, Nigeria, voices rose demanding independence. For now, Britain tried to hold on, promising reforms, offering half measures. But the tide was rising. The lesson of India was clear. The empire was mortal, and the colonies knew it. At home, the British people struggled with the loss. The empire had been their pride, their identity. School children had grown up tracing red on the map, believing their nation ruled the world. Now, the red was fading. Britain was no longer the master of a quarter of the earth. It was just another nation, clinging to its past. Yet, even in defeat, Britain tried to find glory. The story told was not of collapse, but of generosity, an empire giving freedom, not losing it. Politicians spoke of a commonwealth of nations, a family bound not by chains, but by friendship. But behind the words, everyone knew the truth. Britain had been forced to let go. The departure from India revealed something darker. The empire had never truly been in control. It had ruled by dividing, by exploiting, by balancing rivalries. When the British left, the rivalries exploded. The blood of partition was not an accident, it was the legacy of empire. Britain claimed triumph, but left behind scars that would last generations. And so, the sun began to set. Not in one grand sunset, but in flickers and shadows. Each colony lost was another slip toward twilight. Britain still held Africa, still held Hong Kong, still held islands scattered across the seas. But the illusion was broken. Everyone knew the sun was sinking. For the British people, the loss of empire brought identity crisis. Who were they, if not rulers of the world? The empire had given purpose, pride, and power. Without it, Britain seemed smaller, more fragile. Some clung to nostalgia, others embraced change. But the uncertainty was clear. The empire's end meant Britain itself had to be reborn. The world, too, had changed. The Second World War had made America and the Soviet Union superpowers. The Cold War divided the globe into two camps, and Britain found itself caught in the middle, no longer a giant, but an ally, a supporter. The empire's voice was fading from the world stage. But Britain did not vanish. It adapted. It joined alliances, built diplomacy, clung to trade. The empire was gone, but influence remained, echoes of a past that still shaped the present. Yet the truth could not be denied. Britain would never again rule the world. The sun had set. And yet, the empire's ghosts lingered. In India and Pakistan, partition scars bled into wars and divisions. In Palestine, conflict burned on. In Africa, colonial borders drawn in London became lines of future conflict. The empire had left, but the damage it caused remained. For Britain, the loss of India was not just political, but symbolic. The jewel in the crown was gone. The empire had peaked. From here, there was only decline. The empire that once ruled the waves now clung to memories, watching as others, America, Russia, shaped the world it once dominated. The sun had set on India, and with it, the British Empire's age of supremacy. But the unraveling had only begun. Africa, the Middle East, and Asia were waiting, restless, ready to break free. In the next chapter, we witness the empire unravels as Britain loses colony after colony, its once mighty map fading into memory.